then.
Yeah.
Do you have any plans for Halloween?
No, man, nice and quiet, thankfully. We're on reading week from university at the moment, so I'm just kind of into some corrections for assignments, trying to set up assignments for when the students get back, and trying to catch up on my own reading. So I'm taking this week it's nice that I've been able to save my voice a little bit without having to teach classes and stuff. But taking it easy and recovering.
I've been watching a good few like horror films and stuff like that over the last week.
Sweet. I watched Halloween for the first time last week, the original with Michael Myers, and
I watched that last Halloween. What did you think?
I thought it was very funny, but
it's like
I can totally understand why at the time it would be seen as scary or creepy or whatever.
I think it's kind of like it's almost like when you hear about like a certain band being, I don't know, I think the perfect example from metal would be like Venom. Venom were considered like really scary at the time, and I think it's just because when you're the first to do things a certain way, you kind of get a little bit of like leeway. But now, like, there's so many films that have done that slasher thing and made it a lot scarier, more gory. I was laughing my head off watching that for the first time. But
the best thing I saw was like a couple of days later, I saw something on it. I scrolled on Instagram and it was like, you turn around and see this guy behind you. It was the Michael Myers. And I was like, hey, what do you do? And the caption was, I ask him what kind of bills he's paying to be slamming doors in my house. I was like, yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, I watched the most recent one, Halloween Kills. I went to that the other night. And like it was pretty brutal. Like he kills, I gotta say, like it must be over 20 people, and like really? Extremely like pushing people's eyeballs out of their sockets and stuff, and it's just totally different to the first one.
Very Corey Taylor of him.
Yeah. And I also watched Nightmare on Elm Street for the first time there as well. That like I think holds up a bit better, but also like it kind of suffers from the same thing. Like films that era, they didn't have like the creepy music down quite yet. So like they start playing like this real goofy synthesizer music a full kind of 5 seconds before the scary thing happens.
Okay.
But like it's still, you know, it's still entertaining, but like not as if I'm going to lose sleep that night or anything.
Yeah, that's good, because my fiance is a nurse and she's working nights all this week, and she's like, now when I'm out at work, don't be watching any scary films because you'll be here by yourself. I'm not a child, like
batter you.
I watched Midnight Mass. You know your man. I can't remember his name now. He did The Haunting of Hill House. Mike Flanagan.
I heard that's good, but like I'm too much of a pussy to watch that.
Hill House.
Yeah, anything to do with ghosts or supernatural stuff really freaks me out.
Yeah, there's some creepy bits in there and some jumpy bits. And then the interesting thing about Hill House is there's a lot of kind of camera trickery, and there's a lot of things that you don't notice. So if you go back and see, there's actually, if you watch the scenes again and you're not looking at what the characters are doing, you can see people moving in the background or these ghosts appearing on camera that you don't normally. So it's all these kind of tricky bits. But he has this other one called Midnight Mass, which is about like a priest returning to an island, and he has brought it with him, an angel type of thing, and you're like, what the hell's going on? But it turns utter chaos to the last 2 episodes. But it's really slow building, in that like there's lots of really intense dialogue, and because of all the religious connotations to do with the priest, it's very like, okay, this is a bit trippy. Like,
all right, I'll have to check that out.
It's not scary per se, but you do find yourself like, oh god, I'm kind of gripped by this. Like,
yeah. Did you watch Midsummer? That was a bit like that.
No, I didn't know.
Yeah, that's like, it's not the kind of film that has any kind of jump scares or it's just disturbing, I would say. Like the whole film, you're just kind of like, what is going on? Like it's really uncomfortable. Some of the imagery and the scenes and stuff. I won't give it away because it's a good film and it's kind of, the plot is important, but anyway, will we crack into talking about some less spooky or maybe more spooky, depending on how you're looking at us, nutrition stuff, spooky myths and nutrition
What scares
misconceptions.
me about nutrition.
Yeah. So yeah, I everything from the topics we were going to talk about I have here. The only thing I wanted to add in, maybe sort of towards the end, is just a chat about BCAAs, because I've had a few people ask me about that in the last while. But I wanted to kick it off with so I have started coaching out of a new gym, and they have one of these in-body bioelectrical impedance machines. So from what I know, like from having had some lectures about this sort of stuff in college, and done some reading of the research, but not being like super up to date with this. I know measuring body fat in general is something that's very hard to do accurately, even if you're using like the quote unquote gold standard of like a DEXA scan, or I think the one that's supposed to be most accurate is the
Ooh,
one where you're floating in water, whatever that's called.
hydrostatic densitometry.
Yeah, how did I not remember the name of that? Like,
Man, come on, keep up. Underwater weighing works fine.
yeah, but I suppose like what I'm interested to know is like, is the error when you're measuring body fat or skeletal muscle mass on one of these devices, is it enough that you could actually trust that it'll detect a change, or is it so much that you're kind of just guessing every time that you take it?
Yeah, it's that kind of brings up a larger question around when you measure body composition. It's something I've been kind of focused on lately. But there has been evidence to suggest that compared to DEXA, there's a cool paper where they took, I think the in-body has like different versions of its, you know, more and less expensive versions. I'm not sure what the absolute difference between them are. I probably imagine the sensitivity of the
Yeah.
nodes and things like that. But they took 3 different in-body scanners and they compared it to a DEXA scanner. I'm going to come back and comment on your point about the DEXA being gold standard, but they showed it's actually fairly accurate and fairly reliable. But the things that it tends to do is it actually tends to underestimate body fat percentage and fat
Really?
mass. Yeah.
Okay.
And it does give a slight overestimation of fat-free mass.
Okay.
And the thing about this was they measured males and females, so it seems to hold true for both sexes. So there does seem to be a slight overestimation of like fat-free mass compared to DEXA, and an underestimation of body fat and fat mass compared to DEXA.
Yeah.
And I suppose talking about there is like the magnitude of change, or how much of a change would you need to see in metrics of body fat percentage or fat mass or fat-free mass to be an actual true change.
Yeah.
And that kind of feeds into what you brought up, the error of measurement. So it's kind of still a little bit unknown at the moment from what I've seen. And I'd say what I could recommend you to do is, as you go through with your clients, is start to see what kind of discrepancies you're seeing between, you know, pre-training tests and post-training tests, as in a block of training. With any of these type of things, they're massively open to influences like hydration and electrolyte balance. And I think even with BIA in particular, even body position can have an influence because of how fluid will move in the body depending on how the body is orientated. So there are some scanners you can do BIA where people lie down, whereas I think the in-body is done
standing up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So in terms of like the use of the scanner, BIA is good in that it's pretty safe, really non-invasive, and you get the results back straight away, as you've probably seen.
Yeah.
But with I'll say this, for any body composition assessment you're doing, whether that is DEXA or BIA, you obviously have to standardize your conditions before the test. So ideally you'd abstain from consuming kind of alcohol in the 8 to 12 hours beforehand. Ideally you'd avoid training beforehand, so up to 12 hours beforehand. Ideally you would do body comp stuff fasted if you had the opportunity. So if you had a client first thing in the morning, it would be ideal to do it fasted, but with some sort of hydration measure in there to standardize hydration levels. If you do have to do it later on in the evening, ideally it's like within or after about 2 to 3 hours after the last meal. So just make sure that you're performing it under standardized conditions. And if you are doing the best to your ability to standardize it, then they're pretty reliable and repeatable. And I suppose the issue people always have is like, I get this all the time, is like, if you do someone's skin folds, they're like, what's my percentage body fat? How would that compare to I had a DEXA a few years ago? And you're kind of like, you're not directly able to compare them because they're different kind of apartment models and different. And one thing I would say is like, it doesn't necessarily matter the number you get back, because the DEXA number could be different to a BIA number, but the trend of those numbers over time, your training is probably the important thing. So like, what I would say is, if I'm a skin folds person, and if your skin folds go up and they go up more than the area of measurement, then you'd likely say you've gained body fat.
Right.
Whereas I don't need a DEXA to confirm that your body fat has gone from, say, 19% to 20% or something like that. Or you've gone from 7 kilos of fat to 7.5 kilos of fat. Like, it doesn't add anything to the conversation, I don't think.
Yeah. It's all about being able to detect change. Something that I've been saying to people, I've only used that InBody thing with maybe 2 or 3 people so far. But what I'd been saying to them is that it needs to be taken as just one tool in a toolbox for measuring your body composition. So the other tools could be, taking photos yourself, the way that your clothes fit, the weighing scales measurements. I also always say to people as well that, like, if you're getting stronger in the gym over a long period of time, it really minimizes any risk that weight lost is going to be muscle mass, and it maximizes the chance that weight gained is going to have at least some muscle mass in there as well. So just kind of using a collection of things with the InBody or whatever it is. I was going to ask you as well, maybe people listening would be interested to know, like, how exactly does bioelectrical impedance work?
Oh, yeah, cool. So what it does essentially is, you'll see on I haven't actually used an InBody myself. I've seen them done, but I am, and with other BIA, the other ones I would have seen is these handheld devices and the scales you can stand on. So within those handheld devices, or within those scales, there's the nodes that will pass an electrical current through a portion of the body. Yep. So if you had a handheld device, what it would do would pass a node up your right arm, across your chest and back into your left arm, and down to the other node on the machine. And what the reason why I like the InBody a bit more, because it's kind of localized to, if you're holding the scanner, it'll only send the current kind of up your upper body and across to complete the electrical circuit. And if you only stand on a scales, it'll send the current up one leg and kind of reach your torso and come back down the other leg. So if you're to do just upper body or just lower body, you could be missing a portion of the body. Whereas with the InBody, because you stand on the scale that has nodes and you also hold nodes in your hand, you've got a more likely full body representation, I think. So basically how it works, like I said, it passes an electrical current, and any of your tissues that have high water content, for example, lean body mass, muscle tissue, organs, things like that, they'll have high water, high electrolyte content. The current can pass through those, or is conducted through those a little bit quicker. Whereas in the tissues that have less water, so for example, fat tissue, the current will be impeded a little bit, so it'll be conducted slower. So it kind of makes this assumption that if you have more body water, you've got more lean tissue, and that's why it estimates your muscle mass based on that. Whereas if you have less body water, it's got more resistance or more impedance. So you've got less muscle tissue or less lean tissue and more fat tissue.
So the idea is the electrical current will pass easier through a leaner person.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. But it's really simplistic in nature, but you can see how it's really open to influences like things like your hydration status, because you could have someone who has been training for 12 weeks with yourself, and they come in and for whatever reason they had a bad day the day before, or they're dehydrated, and they do a scan, and because it doesn't measure as much body water, it thinks you've lost lean tissue. So that's where the kind of trick in standardization comes in as well. And other things, like, to kind of take that a step further, when you mentioned DEXA, like, I've done DEXAs in the past, I've used them, I have seen, and it's been shown that they're open to influence like hydration status, muscle glycogen content, and even creatine status.
Yeah.
So anything that's going to pull water into cells in lean tissue, where there's a kind of a measurement of that, that can influence the results of these scans. So it's just important to try and standardize as much as you can the pre-test diet, pre-test hydration levels, ideally testing at the same time of day under the same conditions as close to as possible to reduce the likelihood of error. And then even still, like we said earlier, every machine, every method you use to measure body composition has an error of measurement associated with it. So what you're trying to do is figure out, has the number changed? If it has changed, is that beyond the error of measurement? So it's actually a true change. And if it's still within the error of measurement, you could be like, well, it's, you know, it's not likely that you've gained a percent body fat, or I can't remember off the top of my head. I do think it's fairly narrow for BIA, which is one of the good things. Like it's quite sensitive.
Right.
I just can't remember off the top of my head. You know, I think it might be like 1.6% either side it's active to, or something like that.
Sure.
So if you gained 2%, you could argue, okay, that's outside the error of measurement. So you've gained fat. Or if you lost 2%, it's outside the error of measurement. So you've lost 2%. But again, over time, what's more important? The trend is continuing downwards.
Yeah.
Or the number you're getting back, I suppose.
I kind of, I suppose, quite related to that. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about. So we know that you need to be in a calorie deficit for losing body fat. Like if you're going to be using these machines or whatever measurement for measuring your body fat, and like knowing that you need to be in a calorie deficit is the easy part. The hard part then is figuring out how you're going to create that in a way that's going to be sustainable for you or the person that you're going to be coaching or whatever. So I was wondering, from your own experience with working with people, what are some of the strategies that you've found to be quite effective for people for creating a calorie deficit? I know some people like to use apps. I've noticed people that who are kind of quite like maths and sciencey minded are quite happy to, you know, get MyFitnessPal or Chronometer or whatever app and actually log in every single thing that they eat and go for a calorie target. And some people, that seems to just freak them out totally, and they seem to be better off just being given basic guidelines of habits or behavior to go for, like fistful of protein at each meal or whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of what you said there in terms of who's the person sitting in front of you, like who's that individual, and what kind of makes them tick, and what do they like to do, and more importantly, what do they not like to do or not want to do.
Yeah.
I suppose that kind of leads into the kind of art of coaching and understanding who it is. And even there can be times where people don't want to do things, but you as the coach are kind of a bit like, well, it's in your best interest to do it this way. So without being dismissive of other concerns and things. So I would say that, and it's not for everyone, like you said, there is a benefit to tracking at some point. So using an app for a period of time. But depending on the person, it might not be the first thing I recommend. So if I did have, say, a person that wasn't keen on tracking to the gram and using apps in MyFitnessPal, there still has to be some sort of meet me kind of halfway of like, you need to get some sort of handle on what it is you're actually currently taking in.
Yeah.
And things I've done in the past is really boil it down to using, like you said, hand sizes or hand portion guides. So like a palm size portion of protein, cup palm size of carbohydrates, fist size serving of veggies. Don't typically get people to weigh out or measure their fats per se. Usually because if they're eating, you know, animal products and things like that, they're probably going to get their fat, or if they're cooking with oil and things like that, they're probably going to get their fat in anyway. Maybe if they're having nuts and things like that, then that's how you'd help them portion it. So get them to use things like that and just start to see how they're feeling, energy levels, like you said, training performance in the gym or on the pitch. And other things then I've used is, or are, what kind of household measurements do they have available to them? So a common thing I would have had with younger guys coming up, like, oh, you know, what do you have for dinner? And they'd be like, oh, I have, you know, chicken and pasta. And you're like, okay, so how much pasta do you have? And you're met with that kind of blank look of, I don't know.
Loss.
And I'm, yeah, exactly. But like a lot for him, like if he's a 120 kilo prop, a lot for him is like 2 meals worth for me.
Or it's like the skinny guy who's trying to gain muscle and he's like, I'm eating loads.
Yeah. But are you? And how
Yeah.
much is that? So things I would have got them to do is really basic of like, have you got any measuring cups or mugs or anything at home?
Mm.
No. Do you have a mug that you drink tea out of? And literally it's as simple as, I have my favorite mug. Okay, what I want you to do is pour the rice into the pot. And before you cook it, pour it into that mug and tell me how much of that mug that equals to. So then at least I have some gauge of it's around half the mug or it's a full mug.
Yeah.
So I know next time that, okay, if we want to get into a calorie deficit or we want to get into a calorie surplus, I need to change the measurement compared to his mug. So next time, instead of having a full mug, have 3/4 or have
Mm.
half the mug. And you start to kind of just get them thinking about like when you're adding sauce to things, do you just lash it on or do you use a spoon? And you start to be like, okay, start using spoons and see how much that equates to. And again, it's not as accurate as weighing anything out or getting grams and absolute calories, but it puts people like in the headspace of actually thinking about the amounts they're eating,
Yep.
which for a lot of people is the key thing, is to actually stop and think, are you mindlessly shoveling cheese on your omelette, or are you actually kind of a bit more conservative because you understand, well, if I fire on 2 handfuls of cheese, that's an extra 300 calories. That's the reason I'm not losing fat or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's toss up between, you've got these potentially gold standard things that you would love to do, but then where on the spectrum is your client in relation to that, and what's actually going to be the most practical and baby step, small step win, get them on the kind of path.
Yeah.
I would think.
I think that if you can track for at least a portion of time, one really powerful thing that it does is that it teaches you how to kind of have a rough idea or an estimate of the calories that are in common foods. So you can get a handle on the fact that probably most times that you're having that fist-sized portion of a cut of meat or something, it's probably going to be around 250 calories, maybe 300 calories. You can get an idea of like that, if you just add a tablespoon of peanut butter to like the protein shake for the crack, that's actually adding in a lot of calories for not an awful lot of protein in return. And I'm not saying that people would have to do that forever, but I think in some ways you can make yourself very susceptible to fads and different kind of dieting methods if that's the only thing that you ever rely on for managing your calorie intake, if you never figure out like how many calories are actually in typical foods.
Yeah, I think so. But I think in relation to like the fad diets, they typically don't talk about calories. They
No.
talk about kind of foods or food groups, and it kind of, that's why it's so easy. That's why it's the secret. Whereas the fundamental law of thermodynamics is calories in, calories out, and how you achieve those calories from types of food quality, amounts, all that stuff. They're the kind of intricate bits that you need to work on with your clients in terms of what suits their lifestyle, their schedule, food preferences, kind of as a social norms and cultural norms could be huge as well.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing I would say with like the addition of using something, or the positive of using something like the hand model, handy portion guide, I call it, is I think some of the reason why people might fall off the diet or fall off track is because they might have a social occasion, and especially now things reopening, you've got more chances to go out for meals or go out and meet your friends, and you don't want to be anxious about having to go out with people and not know, well, am I having 200 grams of rice here? Whereas you could even kind of look at it and be like, well, I normally give myself a cup, ham and a half worth of a serving. How much does it look like on the plate?
Yeah.
So other things I've done is in line with the handy portion guide of giving people like, what does my plate look like guides for different scenarios. So, a rest day, light training session, post heavy training session in terms of pitch work, or carb load days, type of things like that. So then at least if they do go out, or, the lads was common enough, if they had a big enough break between sessions, they go to the cafe for their breakfast. So I don't want to be going to the breakfast bar with them and be like, okay, so only have 2 rashers there and 2 eggs. So kind of give them the tools that they know, like, 2 eggs here and a rasher, that gives me my kind of protein target, and then maybe I could get a bowl of oats, which would be my carb target. And How does it look like and things like
I'm
that.
just imagining them being like, Rich, can I get a croissant?
It's easier to ask for forgiveness, isn't it?
Gotta eat your veggies first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I did that with the chef for a summer camp. Because we had like under 18s, and I said to the chef when he was dishing up, I was like, the first thing that goes on the plate is the veg, which is kind of counterintuitive because you think with rugby players it would always be protein, but I was so adamant that these guys needed to get some micronutrients into them because they were training 2 or 3 times a day and developing athletes, and I was like, the the veg goes on the plate first, and all the players would complain to the chef, and he's like, I don't care. Richie said the veg goes on first. So
Yeah.
eventually what he had to do was like mix the veg into the beans, and then they were able to eat it. So I was like, okay, we'll compromise. They still get their veg in and they stop complaining. So we've kind of won a little bit here, I think.
You're like sticking carrots and broccoli into the steak.
Oh yeah.
Um, the other thing I wanted to ask about is the so for years there was this myth going around that there's a very rigid post workout window for protein consumption if you want to optimize the gains, and I think it was touted as being something as small as like 20 or 30 minutes after you finish training. And who knows how many people to this day still like try to make sure they chug down a protein shake within that time period because of that. I'm sure it probably came as usual. We were discussing this via text the other day from some kind of study that was misinterpreted, or a single study that found a result and then got passed around. I do know from something Brad Schoenfeld was saying a couple of years ago, I think, that there is a post-workout window, but it's much larger. I think up to maybe even 4 hours or so could potentially be enough, but even more. So,
Yeah.
I'd love to get your thoughts on that. You'd be more up to date with the research on that than I would be.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is something I still see people talk about a lot. I think one of the I heard this recently. I think one of the main reasons it came out was in the late 90s. John Ivey, who would have done a lot of previous research on carbohydrate intake with Ed Coyle, the famous 33% longer study, that research group. John Ivey
Is this
released
the
a book.
Lucozade thing?
Yeah. That was
Okay.
from like an Ed Coyle paper back in the 80s, where they had
Okay.
two groups of people run on a treadmill, and they basically got them to run until they couldn't run anymore. And one group wasn't given anything, and the other group was given this 6 or 8% carbohydrate solution, and they lasted 33% longer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where all that advertisement and stuff came from, I think.
Yeah.
But other members of that group, so John Ivey released a book in the late 90s, I want to say, that was called Nutrient Timing.
Okay.
So this is an entire book on nutrient timing, when even now in 2021, we're still kind of, well, I don't think we are debating it. We understand its importance, but we also understand where it fits in the overall hierarchy of important factors.
Yeah, much lower down the pyramids.
Yeah, well, much higher up.
Sorry, higher up the pyramid. Yeah. Lower down the hierarchy.
Down the ladder. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in terms of like this idea, it was like you said, people used to think that unless I chugged some whey protein within 15 minutes or 20 minutes of finishing my workout, the workout was completely wasted and I might as well not have trained.
Yeah.
When you think about it logically, you're like, hey, what? No, what? How? That doesn't make any sense. Or
it'd be a really inefficient way for our bodies to adapt to training.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. The good example I heard is like, the lads that do like, they walk the rack, dumbbell lateral raises, and they have like the dumbbell set up, but the last set of dumbbells is met with a protein shake. So it's like, finish walking the rack and you get your shake in. And I've seen people do it, and I've seen people like literally sprint to the changing rooms. Yeah. So there is, like you said, this post-workout anabolic window, as people call it, but I do think it can last up to around 48 hours in like healthy male trainees. Could be, like muscle protein synthesis can remain elevated for that long. I think muscle protein breakdown remains elevated for around 24 hours. So you probably do have around, let's say, 24 hours.
Now, sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah,
is that the length of time in which you could still get like some kind of a positive effect, or if we're talking like optimizing it, it would stretch out that
Uh,
far as well.
no, that wouldn't be for optimal. That just means you
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
potentially. So if you take most people who train in a gym, probably train at the same time of the day, a couple of days a week.
Yeah.
So for the people that are training a couple of days a week and they're going to train, let's say you train at 7 in the morning before work, like you still have until 7 in the morning the next day before your next training session. That's still a full 24 hours where if you get enough protein in that window, all of a sudden getting extra in or getting it all in that, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. window doesn't make much of a difference.
Right.
The trick with this, I suppose, is people that are undertaking multiple training sessions per day. So like your top level athletes or mixed modality athletes that might gym in the morning and train pitch in the afternoon, or so then you have a narrow window because you have like this potential interference effect of going out in the pitch and doing a different type of training, and all of a sudden you could be blunting protein synthesis.
Right.
So what essentially happens is by undertaking resistance training or doing a gym session, you kind of just sensitize your muscles for the uptake of nutrients. And resistance training stimulates what's called muscle protein synthesis, which is this kind of mechanism whereby we build new proteins. And for the purpose of strength and hypertrophy, we're building more contractile proteins in terms of actin and myosin.
Yeah.
So the thinking there is that if we're at rest and we consume some amino acids or we consume some protein, we'll get a small increase in muscle protein synthesis because we have amino acids. We can use those amino acids to build proteins. If we do resistance training, we get an increase in protein synthesis, same signal. So the combination of resistance training plus amino acids or protein, you get this kind of synergistic effect where you get an increased rate of muscle protein synthesis. Okay. So throughout the day, we have this kind of cyclical pattern where synthesis is elevated and then decreases to a point where you've got more breakdown than you've got synthesis. So this is kind of a natural occurring process. You can stimulate synthesis, like I said, by eating, and the best way to kind of do it is to match that cyclical periodically proteins throughout the day, which kind of throws up a larger question of what are you doing in the pre-workout window? Are you consuming amino acids, and is there a potential effect that the amino acids you've consumed in the pre-workout window are actually already in the system and are better positioned to get into the muscle immediately after the training session, and does that reduce the need to have amino acids immediately after? So I think like and there is evidence to suggest that delaying protein feeding, you may not get the same rise in muscle protein synthesis. So I do think there is evidence to suggest that while it is sensitized for, like I said, 24 hours, it's not like you should do your gym session and then wait 12 hours before you eat. Closer to the training session is likely going to be better, but it's not like you have to literally consume the shake as soon as the dumbbell touches the floor of your last exercise. You probably do have time to take a shower, go home, and actually eat a meal. So for any elite athletes or people undertaking multiple training sessions, I'd say within the first hour, ideally. For general populations, you probably have a decent enough window where you're not under that much pressure. And what I do think is important as well is, rather than focus narrowly on that kind of post-workout window, is actually think about what your total protein intake per day is. And where does that window fit within your day? And maybe if it's the case you're training first thing in the morning and you don't have time to have breakfast, then maybe the post-workout window becomes more important, because it's an opportunity to kind of make up for missed protein feeding before training. So you get extra in your post-workout window. But again, the thing I always say is, what's your total protein intake per day? Because if you get 40 or 50 grams in that post-workout window, and then you don't eat enough protein the rest of the day, and you only get, another 50 grams the rest of the day, well, you're still down on your total protein intake. So the window wasn't as important.
That seems to be the overarching thing for protein research, that like the total protein intake seems to be the most important thing.
Yeah, and to a smaller degree, the distribution of protein intake. So like a common question would be like, well, if I need 160 grams of protein a day, can I just have a big breakfast with 160 grams because I've hit my total?
Jesus, that's a lot of food.
Yeah, I know, right? But like, and that's definitely an extreme example. But there are people that have like 70 or 80 grams in a sitting.
Yeah,
and they're kind of like, oh yeah, I'm not going to eat again. You're kind of like, well, like I talked about, that cyclical pattern of synthesis versus breakdown seems to suggest that we're better off having kind of doses more frequently, so roughly every 3 to 4 hours throughout the day.
That's always been my That's always been my hunch. Like when people have asked about like intermittent fasting and stuff like that, it would just seem to me make more sense that having those amino acids in your bloodstream more regularly throughout the day would optimize the protein synthesis a bit more.
Yeah. So I think if anyone is interested in undertaking, I don't recommend purely fasted training, um, because what can happen is when you're fasted, you can get an uptake in, I suppose, amino acid oxidation or leucine, depending on the type of training and duration of training, will dictate how much of that happens. So that can be, like I said, important for muscle protein synthesis. And with athletes and people who are training, you really don't want them losing lean body mass or lean tissue. You want to try and preserve that, because that's going to give them their strength and their force output and all the good things associated with performance. So for anyone that's undertaking fasted training, they want to get maybe more fat oxidation, I would suggest you do some kind of, protein fasted, as in have a whey beforehand or something.
Yeah.
That'd be the one caveat, just to kind of offset any potential negatives of, because even when you do finish resistance training, while synthesis is elevated, breakdown is elevated as well. So kind of the total turnover of amino acids can be elevated.
Yeah.
You just don't want to run the risk of training fasted and then missing, another 4 hours of not eating, and you have more breakdown than you have synthesis for that period of time. And you just kind of end over in this overall net kind of balance that doesn't really show any adaptations or kind of improvements.
Sure. And in terms of the current recommendations for protein intake, in terms of grams per day for people who are doing strength training and trying to optimize that, are we still at kind of 1.5 to 2 grams per kilo body weight per day? I know I'd seen some research recently that was indicating you could go even beyond that potentially.
Yeah, I would always say it's between 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kg.
Okay.
Based on some of the meta-analysis that came out a few years ago. That seems to be the kind of sweet spot where a lot of the adaptations take place without being excessive. For people that are just involved in kind of strength training, like I said, once a day, a couple of days a week, 1.6 is probably a good starting point. If you're involved in more vigorous training outside of that, then you can push it closer to 2. I probably have most people on 2.
Yeah.
I do have a hunch that younger developing athletes probably need a little bit more, like towards 2.2 or maybe even higher.
Just because of the need to put on muscle mass.
Yeah. And I think because they're potentially so newer trainees probably need a little bit more protein compared to experienced trainees, just because experienced trainees kind of maximize their sensitivity to protein and amino acids. So more isn't necessarily better. Whereas younger trainees and even older people can do with having a little bit more, because of I suppose for older people, the effects of aging and muscle atrophy and that kind of reduction in sensitivity. So you kind of offset that by feeding more protein. And I just think with some of the stuff I'm reading around developing athletes is their caloric intake is probably a lot higher than we think it is. So one of the things I'm definitely guilty of is applying adult resting metabolic rate or basal metabolic rate equations to adolescence, and that doesn't factor in the heightened need for additional calories because of maturation and development of puberty and things like that. So that actually pushes their total calorie needs higher, which allows you a bit more leeway to go with higher protein, but you still obviously partition the macronutrients, carbs and fats within that. But I do think because they're newer to training, they could benefit from having higher protein intakes.
You do see kids who are like 15 years old and eat like an absolute, like a horse, and are bone thin because they're growing at such a rapid rate.
Yeah.
And I think as well that, like for me, I weigh 92 kilos at the moment. If I'm going for that 2.2 or even 2 grams per kilo body weight, 180 grams of protein in a day is quite a bit of ground to cover. And I think it's a bigger reason why I would definitely try to get more feedings throughout the day than just limit myself to 2 or 3 meals, because protein as a macronutrient, as you know, is extremely filling. So if you're trying to get like 90 grams in just 2 meals, like that's a lot of work.
Can be, yeah.
Um,
And kind of there is some of the evidence that I think it was from Schoenfeld and Aragon that seemed to highlight that rather than so look at it in terms of your total intake per day, but then you can split it up on a meal by meal. So you can have a 0.4 or 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram per meal. So to take a really basic example, if you've got a 100 kilo athlete and you set them on 1.6 grams per kg, and you look at their per meal feeding of 0.4 grams per kg, that's 4 servings of 40 grams of protein, which isn't actually that difficult when you think about it.
yeah.
So a really good breakfast, a good lunch, a good dinner, and maybe a pre-bed snack that all have 40 grams in it. So that's your start point, for example. But then you might tweak and be like, I don't know if I get home from work late or I train late, I can't really eat 40 grams before bed. And you're like, okay, well, why don't we split that into 220 grams or have a morning snack and an evening snack after dinner or something like that. There's kind of plenty way to break it up, and it kind of feeds into personal preference. I do think less than probably 3 meals or 3 feeds throughout the day probably is suboptimal.
Right.
Just for the per meal amount, and you do need a minimum amount of protein per meal to stimulate that protein synthesis. And that's why it's good to be aware of the per meal recommendations as well.
And very last protein question, because we're doing a lot of protein there. One I get asked quite regularly when people are going to purchase their whey protein for the first time is, what is the difference between whey isolate and whey concentrate? And is it something that people need to be conscious of?
It's not something I place a whole pile of emphasis on, to be honest with you. It's something I don't really know. I suppose the differences are, like, if you had a whey concentrate, it means that per 100 grams, it's kind of between maybe 30 and 80% of that could be protein. So meaning the scoop you have in front of you or the bag you have in front of you contains other nutrients other than just whey protein. And because of the minimal amount of, obviously whey protein is still a processed food, because of the minimum amount of processing to get protein concentrate, they tend to be a little bit cheaper. Whereas if you had something that's an isolate, like the kind of name suggests, it's isolating whey protein. So you typically have 90% and above protein by weight. So it takes some of those additional nutrients out, and it can take things like lactose out as well. So maybe for people that have lactose or dairy intolerances, it could be an okay option if it's below their lactose threshold for the day. But I suppose on the back of that, having a little bit more processing makes it a little bit more expensive. But you get more protein per scoop essentially. Yeah.
So in the concentrate, you're getting more milk, sugars, and fat and stuff like that in the scoop.
Yeah. Potentially. Yeah. There's another one you might see, but I don't know if it's sold on shelves, is protein hydrolysates.
Yeah.
And these are just proteins that are pre-digested. They're getting a lot of attention in research because they're really rapidly absorbed, and if they're rapidly absorbed, they're getting to work a bit quicker. So the drawback of these is because of the amount of processing and pre-digesting involved, it ramps the price up a little bit more. They also taste awful. They're awful.
Yeah. The name doesn't suggest it anyway.
I've been in
digested.
I've been in 2 research studies. I was a researcher on one for protein hydrolysis years ago. And we opened the bag, and the 2 of us were just like, no.
Like a shaker that's been left out in the sun.
Worse. But yeah. And then I was a participant in one recently, and they're actually using fish-derived hydrolysis. And
come on.
really, really hard to mask the scent or odor of fish, even though they flavored it like chocolate caramel or something. So you got this really nice chocolate caramel taste on the tongue, and then this after whiff of like tuna, and you're like, what's going on?
So you gotta lean into that flavor and make it like deadliest catch protein.
Yeah, man. I don't know if it'll make it to market as a
no, probably not very practical.
Well, you could add it to foods, I suppose. Like you could add it to like fish soup or something, or things like that, or fish sauces. and boost
I
the protein
suppose.
content of things like that. So they'll find a use for it, I'm sure.
And on the topic of fish, actually, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was fish oils, omega 3s, fatty acids, and that sort of stuff. I suppose cod liver oil is probably the most popular one. Do you think they're worth supplementing with? Do you think there's enough research to indicate that? I know heart health is one of the things that they've been purported to help with.
Yeah, I suppose when it comes to the question of are they worthwhile supplementing with, I'd always take it back to this food first approach and seeing like, well, how much omega 3s and omega 6s are you getting in your diet?
Mm,
Not like already, and easiest ways to do that is likely through amount of fish you're eating, so like salmon, mackerel, cod, things like that.
yeah.
So if people aren't opposed to eating fish, it's a ready source of protein that also provides these omega 3s and omega 6s. So why not just include a couple of servings of fish in the diet per week?
Mm,
I suppose why they get such focus is because of the type of their polyunsaturated fatty acids, and there's two main types or two key ones in omega 3s, these DHA and EPA they're called. So these are essential nutrients because the body can't make them to any appreciable degree by itself.
mm,
There is one form that's found mostly in plants like flax and flaxseed oils called alpha linoleic acid, ALA, and the body can, to a certain degree, make EPA and DHA from ALA, but it's not enough to cover the needs. So people would supplement then or eat foods containing omega 3s to boost the amount they have in their body for functions. So
yeah.
the reason why they're important is probably for cell membrane function, so the fluidity of our cell membranes, which can help with controlling the passage of things in and out of the cells. They can potentially improve muscle protein synthesis, which makes them useful in things like we've had players that have been injured, and one of the supplements we provide alongside extra protein is fish oils to help with kind of protein synthesis. I think in older trainees as well, it's been shown to help with muscle protein synthesis. The other thing is they can help with controlling inflammation and cognitive function potentially. So these always have health implications, but then if you think towards people involved in strength sports or athletes, this can potentially have performance benefits as well.
Yeah. So
Um,
potentially worth. So for me, I don't take any fish really outside of tuna every now and then. I actually quite like some fish like salmon and mackerel, but I found a while ago that it would just make me feel sick. I think I have some kind of issue with like really fatty, oily cuts of meat or fish. But I can take cod liver oil or fish oil tablets fine. So do you think that it's worth doing for somebody who doesn't eat fish?
I would think so because
Yeah.
because of the fact that they're these essential nutrients that we can't readily make or make enough of, then it's important to get them in.
Yeah.
So a supplement can be of use there. My hesitation, I have a lot of hesitations around recommending supplements kind of willy nilly.
Mm,
But I think in particular things like fish oil is because of their structures. There's these long carbon chains essentially, and because of the way they're kind of structured is they can actually undergo oxidation quite easily, and this can actually kind of spoil them. I think the term they use in research and is like rancid. They become rancid or rancidity, I think. So when you're processing the fish oils to actually make these capsules or tablets, it kind of oxidizes the structures. And when this happens, it reduces the amount of DHA and EPA that's actually in the product. So then when you actually compare the product under like lab conditions compared to what's on the label, they find that actually is less in the product.
right.
So it can be kind of tricky to standardize based on your product and where you're getting it from and costs and things like that. But the short answer is if you're not eating enough fish, then yes, it's probably beneficial to include them.
Okay. Interesting. Um, Food intolerance tests. So you've probably heard quite a few people say that they went off and got one of these tests and they came back saying that they were intolerant to all sorts of things and now they can't eat them anymore. Um, I don't know the accuracy, the validity of these tests, if they're really reliable thing to be using. If impression I've gotten from people who are actual nutrition experts is that they're not, and that I would think, the big drawback of that is you might be um, stopping somebody from taking in a food that's perfectly fine for them.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, they're interesting things. I can kind of see why, like, people typically go for these things because they might see they have a digestive problem, or maybe they feel there's an autoimmune issue.
Mm.
The main reason why would be allergies. I don't know how much of this is kind of placebo, where people feel like, oh, this food makes me bloated, or this food, I don't know if placebo is the right word there. But that kind of thing. Oh, I can't eat bread; it makes me bloated. But they've heard that bread can bloat people, or
Yeah.
Some people do get like joint pain, swelling. People do get like
no SIBO, I guess.
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Because there's an expectation of a negative effect.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's kind of almost predispose themselves to having this because they've heard of it, and they kind of self-diagnose themselves. So I suppose people take them or go and have them done because they might like want to uncover some kind of hidden food sensitivity, perhaps.
Yeah.
And there does seem to be evidence out there to suggest there's foods that can have reactions with digestive or autoimmune or allergy symptoms. So it does make sense then that as a consumer, you could go and get these tests done. But there doesn't seem to be much evidence in that these food scent tests or there's hidden food sensitivities are driving any underlying damage when you don't have any symptoms per se. In terms of like the type of tests you can do, some of them are absolute nonsense. I don't know if you heard of any of the types of tests you can do.
Some of them, they just rub food on your skin, don't they?
I think so, yeah.
Surely that's going to be slightly different to the effect it has when it's in your gut.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, they prick you on the arm or something. One of the funniest ones I'm aware of is like it's called muscle response testing. And what they do is they get you to hold a glass jar that has an extract of the food in it, while the person pushes down on your other arm to test for weaknesses that have been induced by apparently holding this food extract. So very accurate, very reliable, very repeatable. Yeah, that's kind of. I've heard of other ones where like they'll set up electrodes on either point of the skin and they'll place the food's extract on the skin or somewhere in that electrical current, and again they'll measure the impedance, kind of like we spoke about earlier. And the impedance will tell you how sensitive you are to that food and things like that. So it's kind of crazy when you think about the nonsense that's out there.
I mean, the one that makes the most sense to me, and again, I'm not sure like how much scientific backing it has behind it, is just that whole idea of kind of like food elimination. So like just minimizing your diet down until you figure out what seems to be giving you the issue.
Yeah, and a lot of the results from these tests are they put you on some kind of elimination diet.
Right.
So some of the other tests out there, there's like this ALCAT test, and it measures this white blood cell response. And there's another one that measures the change in cell volume size in response to eating these foods. And they've done that in IBS patients. But what they found was that the patient's symptoms relieved when they followed a low FODMAP diet. But the argument against that is like a low FODMAP diet is known to reduce IBS symptoms. So you could have just done that anyway without having to do the test type of thing. So I suppose the other test that gets used is this immunoglobulin G or IgG test, which is meant to, so immunoglobulins are these immune proteins that are secreted in response to an antigen being present. So the assumption is if you eat a food, it sets off this immunological reaction whereby you secrete these antibodies to fight that. But what's actually, I think, happens is just by eating that food, you get an IgG response anyway.
Yeah.
So you may not actually necessarily be symptomatic or sensitive or allergic to that food, but the immunoglobulins antibodies still show up. So there's just not enough evidence to indicate that it actually works in the way it says it does. And the problem associated with this is the cost involved. Like some of the tests aren't as expensive, a couple of €100. Some of them could be maybe up to $1,000.
Jesus.
And like you said, if you're you're going to spend this much money, it may not actually provide much helpful information. And like you said, if it puts people off certain foods or food groups, they could be missing a whole host of other nutrients, and they could end up deficient in other nutrients because they're avoiding food groups. Maybe there's psychological implications of trying to be overly restrictive with food groups. And again, maybe people actually convince themselves they're intolerant of a food when they're not.
Hmm.
So they have this psychosymptomatic
think
placebo effect.
I think that's very feasible. I'm pretty sure that I had that back in the CrossFit days of my youth when I first got into the paleo diet. And I mean, like, I think people were even saying that rice or certain types of rice were bad for good health. So I can remember sometimes having my stomach feel a bit weird if I would eat white rice. Now that doesn't happen to me at all. And I suppose there's also probably an argument as well that if you don't eat a food for a long period of time and then come back to it, you could have issues with digesting it. I know a lot of people who followed the paleo diet and didn't eat bread for ages, and then, you know, they allowed themselves like a cheat day or whatever, and, you know, they ate the bread and they didn't feel too good, and they were like, oh god, it just goes to show how bad bread really is for you. And it's like, we haven't eaten it for like 6 months.
Shows how efficient your body is at adapting to what you're giving it or what you're not giving it.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that with how much better I think in general people from certain regions on the planet are to digesting milk or dairy products than people say like in like the eastern countries.
Yeah, and alcohol.
And alcohol, yeah. All the tasty stuff, basically, yeah. All the
All
stuff that makes life enjoyable,
the
ice
real
cream and
macros.
beer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. There's like that to be said to that, because what can happen in some of the research with athletes that swap over to more of a ketogenic or high fat diet is they think the enzymes related to fat digestion get upregulated. So you get more enzymes that are concerned with digesting fat. So your body's like, well, if the only or major source of macro we're getting for energy is fat, then we better get really good at using this. And all of a sudden, then you reintroduce a load of carbohydrates, let's say for your race. And it's kind of like, well, all the builders are here, but they've been trained in one particular skill set. Like, I think Lane Norton said it really well, where it's like you have a warehouse that specializes in building ships, and all of a sudden you turn over and say, we're now going to build planes. So you retrain all your staff and actually hire more staff to build the plane. And all of a sudden the owner comes in and is like, build me a ship right now. And you're kind of like, but we haven't done that in so long. How are we meant to?
And at the most critical points of your preparation, you know?
Yeah, day before the event, the race. Yeah.
That's why, like, I mean, I haven't trained anybody for like a powerlifting meet before, but like if they were asking me about like nutrition and they were thinking of like changing something radically on the day, I would be inclined to say just eat normally what you usually would, because when you start introducing all this new stuff into the mix, there's a high likelihood that you're going to feel weird.
100%. Yeah, definitely guilty. When I competed in powerlifting, first time I competed, I thought I needed to carb load because I'd done all this research and studying around carb loading and endurance athletes. And I think I put myself on like 8 grams carbs per day the day before. And my body just wasn't able for it. Like, it just flowed through me. Like, it just, I think I felt more sick because of the volume of food I was eating. And felt great on the day, but I probably could have stopped at 5 grams per kg and had the exact same effects without the negative effects.
Yeah. For all like 60 seconds of activity you probably get.
Yeah, exactly. And then so 9 lifts. I was like, that's a good point.
Yeah. Although it's a lot of standing around, so you definitely want to have some food in your stomach. So last kind of supplement related one I wanted to go through. We're getting towards the end here anyway. Zinc MA sometimes it's called, or zinc or magnesium as a sleep supplement. I've heard people say pretty consistently that they get some pretty funky dreams taking this stuff, but as to whether or not it actually helps you get to sleep quicker or improves the quality of the sleep that you get, I'll let you talk about that.
So do you mean like ZMA as the combined supplement?
Well, I think that's generally what's purported to be like the the way to take it, right? Combining the two of them together, that it's meant to have some effect on sleep.
Yeah, I think the vivid dreams. So ZMA is zinc and magnesium aspartate, but it's combined with vitamin B6, which is peroxidine. And I actually think it's the peroxidine that causes the weird dreams, because I do think there's a paper out there where they gave people 250 milligrams of peroxidine and they said they experienced the weird dreams.
Yeah. And what
Um,
is peroxidine?
vitamin B6,
Okay.
which is another. So one of the things that always confused me was that it's like zinc, magnesium, and B6. So I was like, so why wasn't it called ZMB?
Yeah, I've only heard ZMA.
Yeah, it's ZMA. It's because of the type of magnesium aspartate, that it's kind of chemical formulation or whatever. I think there's only one paper that showed a performance benefit following sleep in supplements with ZMA, and it was from the lab that created ZMA. So take that with a pinch of salt.
Yeah,
So it was your
maybe
man
some
Victor.
bias there.
Was it Victor Conte came up with this?
Victor Conte is the guy who was given the steroids to all the baseball players, right?
Balco, yeah, he came up with
And
this.
used to be the bass player in
Yeah.
what was that band?
I don't know, but yeah, that's hilarious.
Such a bizarre life.
Yeah, what a hero. He created was it the Clear? Was that clenbuterol? That was his baby.
Really? Wow.
I think so. Yeah.
Obviously, some chemistry skills.
We went to the wrong college course.
Yeah.
Bay Area Lab Corporation, Balco in San Francisco. That's what it was. So the Balco scandal. If anyone's looking up Balco, or he actually does one of the few Joe Rogan interviews I like is with Victor Conte.
I haven't seen that one. I didn't see that actually.
Years ago. It was back when Joe was a small fry.
Mm.
But anyway, I think it's hard to get off on a tangent about
Joe Rogan.
It
comes up somehow on every podcast.
Oh my God, it's like it's meant to be. So zinc on its own, haven't seen much in terms of its efficacy on helping people get to sleep. Most times it's prescribed, that I can tell and that I've used in the past, is for colds, so upper respiratory symptoms, where you take it as a lozenge and it acts locally on the mucous membranes. I think with any of these things as well, like I was talking about with the omega-3s, is do a dietary assessment and see if you are actually deficient in these. There doesn't seem to be a massive deficiency of zinc or magnesium in most of the population. The caveat to those is people that are doing a lot of training and are having a lot of sweat losses, because they could lose those minerals through their sweat potentially. So that's why I suppose they make the justification for supplementing in athletes. Magnesium, yes, there is some good evidence to improve sleep in elderly populations, but I think the reason is elderly populations tended to have lower magnesium intakes through their diet anyway, because they typically don't eat as much as they used to eat. So I would again look and see what your overall dietary intake of zinc and magnesium are. And this is where again it comes back to, if you did want to track more precisely, an app can be helpful, or I have nutrition analysis software that I can analyze that stuff when clients come to me if they're concerned about it. I think some of the stuff as well, from talking to people last week around, we were at a conference and they were looking at kind of sleep in athletes, and they're talking about some of the foods they use. And I think one of the comments was like, is it more so to do with the actual food you're giving them, or is it more to do with the fact that it kind of triggers them to think a bit more about their sleep habits?
Right. Yeah.
And
that's always the question with any of these interventions.
I think so. And it's like, is it the fact that you take this tablet and you go, okay, I've taken my sleepy tablet now, so I'm going to feel sleepier when I get into bed, I'm going to sleep better. So have you kind of convinced yourself that you're sleeping better?
I mean, like when they've done studies where they've given people sham steroids and they've gotten some pretty incredible physiological strength gains out of it, it just shows you how powerful the placebo effect is.
Yeah. So remember that, did you see that paper where they gave two groups caffeine, but they told one group it wasn't caffeine and their performance declined? Like, so even you got a power of nocebo as well, which is amazing.
There was one, I don't know if you read it. It was they told people that whether they fell into a group of people who produced a lot of leptin, I think it was, or less. Um, it was some kind of hormone that was involved in like appetite regulation, or fat deposition or whatever. But so they had people who actually naturally produced a lot of it, and people who didn't. And then they told them one way or the other. And the thing that had the biggest impact on their levels of it when they measured at the end were what they had been told, not even like what their natural secretion of it was before the study. So like, it's absolutely crazy, and I think that that's how so many of these people who spin like nutrition myths and misconceptions can get away with it either way, because if somebody believes them is kind of almost the most important thing as to whether it actually works or not. And you see that with the supplement industry as a whole.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Unfortunately.
What would be, like, in that vein, what would be kind of the biggest nutrition misconceptions you feel like you encounter regularly now when you're working with people?
That there is a secret, or that there is one best thing.
Like a one best diet or one best food, or
one best food,
Yeah.
for a particular, like, I saw something yesterday. It's like the 10 best fat burning foods. I'm sure you get this all the time. Like, oh, Killian, what's the best exercise for my legs?
Yeah.
And you're kind of like, well, it's going to be the one that you like doing. You're seeing, progressive overload occurring in. It's not beating you up massively. Like, there's all these factors to factor in. It's kind of the same with diet. Like, there's no best anything. There's optimal, and there's optimal based on research. And then there's, like we talked about earlier, it's where, you take the paper and you sit with the person, and all of a sudden the person's like, I don't have opportunity to eat 5 times a day. And you're kind of like, but the paper says to eat 6 times a day. And you're like,
yeah,
I'm not doing that. So where do you go? So it's this idea that, and it's kind of like you said, it's been kind of cultivated by this idea of people kind of selling something or pushing this idea, and then, oh, it worked for me, or it worked for my neighbor, it worked for my mate, so I should do it and you should do it. And you're like, maybe the reasons why it worked for him were completely different to why it would work for you, or it suited their circumstances, or like a lot of the arguments over this ketogenic, low carb, or carnivore diet is the fundamental is it's getting people more mindful of their caloric intake, and typically they end up in a deficit so they can lose fat. And usually what happens is, because they change the type of foods they're eating, because they have to eat less carbs, or carnivore, they eat more meat, they end up replacing the macronutrient with extra protein.
Right.
So then they get the benefits of extra protein, less calories, and they start to see these changes in body composition, strength, and performance.
I wouldn't say it makes them more mindful of caloric intake, though, because a lot of the camps in these diets seem to be like outright denying that calories even matter. It's just kind of like a happy accident that by following the guidelines of this diet, you end up in a deficit.
Yeah, you've picked me up spot on. I probably misrepresented it there. These guys don't think about anything.
But it's just really, I just find it really ironic, like, to see people arguing so adamantly that like calories don't matter, but yet every single diet has to create a deficit for it to work,
Yeah. It's crazy. It's again, it's people that have like an affiliation to, or an affinity for, or maybe skin in a certain game that they need to push, or I suppose for people that have, like, if you say we're a person that we're advocating low carbohydrate diets, and that was the kind of your thing a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden the research started to come out to, like, well, it actually doesn't matter if you control calories and get your protein right. If you go higher carb or higher fat, it doesn't make much of a difference for most people.
Yeah.
If you've kind of nailed your colors to the mast a few years ago, you have a reputation and a kind of an ego to protect there, where if you turn around and be like, actually, carbs are fine, you could have a mass of followers that are like, what? I'm leaving, I'm out. And if that affects your bottom dollar, bottom euro, then I can totally understand. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can understand why they would have to kind of almost have to kind of double down.
Yeah. The yeah, the logic behind it in their mind makes sense anyway. But I suppose like the last thing I wanted to close out with that's very related to that is like I think it's one thing having people giving out information that is not necessarily scientifically accurate, but it ends up making people more conscious of their nutrition in the long run. And, they still end up with a better diet than if they had just done nothing and they just kept eating crap food and a caloric surplus. But then you have a much more kind of like sinister types of information being put out that, whether it's intentional or not, is potentially actually harmful to people. And a lot of people would argue that like just putting out inaccurate information isn't good enough, regardless, especially if you have a big platform. Like, do you think that nutrition as a sector in the fitness industry needs stricter regulation, both for what can be sold? Say, like in a supplement shop, we know that a huge percentage of what's being sold in there doesn't have research backing. I think there's an ethical argument there that's misleading people, and should there be stricter regulation on who is allowed to dispense advice? Should they have to have met a certain standard for education, for certification? Should things be overseen a little bit more about like what people are and aren't allowed to advise people on?
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of like, if take for example yourself, like you have qualifications in strength conditioning, you've got a master's, and people kind of know what that means and know what kind of level that's to. And then there's like people that have like personal training qualifications, and that kind of gives them the minimum entry requirements to work in a gym and things like that.
Mm.
And that's fine. That's like the minimum barrier to entry, which is great that there is something like that. I don't necessarily know if people are aware of what types of things exist in the nutrition sphere for that, maybe.
Yeah.
So I think from a practitioner point of view, I do think there's a lot of very good processes in place to make sure we're adhering, if we are, ethically sound and want to be the best performance nutritionists or whatever type of nutritionist we can be. So like there are things like, for example, we would have been encouraged throughout our masters to get in accredited by what's called the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register, which is a branch of the British Dietetics Association. So
Okay.
you would submit your qualifications, portfolio, CV, experience, and you do a case study, and they will send it to their panel of nutrition experts and dietitians to be like, this person is clearly in touch with the literature, is a decent level of practitioner. We're happy to stand over this person as a practitioner. So they're your accrediting body.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar, I suppose, to the UK SCA, whereas if you can kind of show them you're able to coach and understand physiology, they're like, we'll stand over you as your accrediting body.
Yeah.
So there are stuff like that out there that exists. And then there's like the Association for Nutrition. Over in Ireland, we have the INDI, Irish Nutrition and Dietetics Institute. And they're becoming a little bit more open to the idea of having nutritionists involved. Previously, you could only register with them if you're a dietitian, but they now have a sport and exercise nutrition group, SENG. And even like the Sport Institute of Ireland have the professional quality assurance program, where again, you submit your qualifications, your CV, case study, and they have practitioners that are like, yeah, we're going to stand over you as an accredited member of, we think you're good enough to do that job, which is fine. But I'm not necessarily sure the public are fully aware of this.
No,
and
I don't think so.
Yeah, and the problem with nutritionist is it's not a protected term like registered dietitian. So there's no legal disincentive, I suppose. So I couldn't just label myself a dietitian because I could be sued because I'm not a dietitian. Whereas I call myself a nutritionist. You can call yourself a nutritionist. Anyone that listens to this can call themselves a nutritionist.
Yeah.
And that's where the trick comes in. So with even things like social medias, anyone can bang, nutritionist in their tagline, or, the difference between having a nutrition cert and being a nutritionist, or like a nutrition cert that you can, I think there's like a FETAC in nutrition, which would be a level 5. How does that stack up compared to someone who's got a master's or a PhD in nutrition?
Yeah.
And how does that get translated to the public? So I think the processes are in place, they're getting better, but it's kind of communicating that or making the public more aware of that.
Yeah.
Because I've had it myself. I've had people like refer me on to people, and I'll chat to them, and they're like, yeah, good to go. Let's get cracking. And I'll be like, oh, do you want me to send through a list of my qualifications? And they're kind of like, no. I'm like,
I will say that, like, from my perspective, I appreciate you saying I've got a master's in strength and conditioning. It strokes my ego and it's really nice to hear. But never once in the process of having a new client come on board have I had them ask me what my qualifications are. Now, you could say, yeah, I have it listed in my bio and Instagram. So maybe you could say, oh, I've already seen that. But I think if somebody really cared about that, they would be inclined to ask, like, oh, where did you do your master's? And, all that sort of stuff. I just don't think it's something that's in people's like thought process when it comes to seeking out coaching, whether that's nutrition coaching or strength coaching or whatever. I think people tend to be more focused on the character or the personality of the coach themselves and the results that they appear to be getting for people, which I would say is why social media is such a potent platform for people, and how they can make it quite easy to kind of masquerade as experts.
yeah. But do you think that then, like, are the general public aware that there are people that have master's levels qualifications working in gyms to be personal trainers, or people that have master's level qualifications working in gyms to have? Is it kind of this spectrum of understanding of the level of qualification? I'm not necessarily you walk in and you drop, yeah, I'm Killian, I have a master's.
Yeah,
definitely work with me. And I totally like results is probably the main thing as to why people want to work with you.
Yeah.
And obviously then how you are as a person.
Yeah, I would agree that a lot of people wouldn't be aware of that. I've had lots of people ask me what I did in college, and when I tell them, they're like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing,
Well, that's it, because when traditionally when I bumped into an old school friend years ago, his dad, and he was like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I'm just finishing my master's. And he's like, oh, I didn't know you wanted to be a teacher. But the kind of traditional sense was it's still a fairly relatively new discipline, all of this kind of
massive
sports science, physiology, sport nutrition, whereby people don't necessarily expect you to have a master's in a, how do you phrase this right? Not to sound like a dick, like a relatable field where like it's in people's faces. Whereas I think previously it was thought of like a master's as only for people that stay in academia or other spheres of operation. I think I could be way off. That's just my view on it.
Well, and look, I don't think that people have to have a master's degree or anything like that in order to be good at their job.
No, not at all.
Like, if anything, I think as long as, maybe it's ideally a science related field, because what college really did for me was it taught me how to think critically, and how to appraise research and evidence and that kind of thing. And that is like a really transferable skill to any area of science. So, theoretically, if somebody didn't go to college, but they've somehow managed to educate themselves on the research and they're staying up to date with it, then I think they could be just as good a coach or better than somebody who went to college and had all of this information thrown at them, but didn't actually engage with it or absorb it. I mean, I see it on online all the time now. People who have PhDs, like PhD level of education, and don't seem or claim to not really fully understand basic principles like progressive overload or specificity, and have huge followings, maybe potentially because they're able to kind of inject that sciencey elements to what they're doing. But I find that quite interesting, and it kind of makes me question whether stricter regulation is really the answer, because in personal training or strength and conditioning, I'll hear people often point to like, oh, look at physiotherapy. Physiotherapy is really well regulated. And it is to a certain degree, but it's not a guarantee that you're going to get somebody who is engaging with the research regularly. I've had physical therapists that have gone to have a much lower barrier of entry and are actually evidence-based and have gotten me far better results than a physio who's, you know, idea of rehabbing a shoulder injury so I can bench again is just doing like 20 reps of a band exercise, you know?
Yeah, it throws up like from the nutrition perspective, I think a bit more regulation would be nicer. But I still don't think for any profession you're still going to get people that don't engage as much as other people.
Yeah, it's the reality.
Yeah, unfortunately, but yeah, it is what it is. Yeah, I didn't mean that to come across like everyone has to have a master's type of thing. It was more so like everyone's perception or understanding that there are people out there that have these qualifications, which could potentially, you know, there is a difference between a FETAC level 5 and a master's degree and it's a spectrum. But like you said, someone could have done a FETAC 5 or 6 or 10 years ago, but has literally read every paper ever since.
Yeah.
So it comes down to the individual, which I suppose is the trick. But again, if you had some kind of body that was like, okay, so you don't have a master's, but you have all this 10 years or 12 years experience plus this qualification. Okay, submit us a case study as to what you did. And the idea behind the case studies, I suppose, is they can try and gauge your ability to reason based on evidence, which they'd be like, okay, you have a scientific approach, which is what they're looking at. Like you said, is can this person think critically? Or is it like, if you apply your case study, for example, and you're like, oh, my player got injured, so I put him on a keto diet for 6 months, they'd be like, okay, why'd you do that? And it's like, oh, it was because I'm a keto guy. They'd be like, no, we're not going to stand over your, you know, that kind of, yeah. So I think some extra could help with practitioners. In terms of supplements, yeah, absolutely. I think the drawback, like you said, is like a supplement is basically taken as safe or effective until proven otherwise. So supplements can be released to market and on shelves before any negative side effects or harmful side effects, or even like just, you know, this doesn't actually work before all of that's uncovered. And then I think in the USA anyway, it's then at the discretion of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to actually, it's on them. It's their burden to go and investigate this and actually remove it from shelves.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a tricky thing. So the supplements don't have to undergo as rigorous testing like pharmaceuticals. They don't have to typically go through clinical trials. And even if they do put supplements through trials previously, I'd say, and some of them aren't of the highest standard or greatest rigor. My major concerns around supplements would be contamination.
Especially for athletes.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
Interestingly, a very well-known Australian strength and conditioning coach was an adjunct professor on my master's. And I think the situation in Australia now is that you have to be an accredited member of the ASCA to work with professional sports. I think that it may also be the case that you have to have some kind of an accredited degree in nutrition as well if you're going to work as a nutritionist. But I was asking them about, you know, how they managed to get it to that standard over there, and he was saying that it actually took like a major fuck up for them to actually start regulating it, where there was some guy who was working with a really high level, I think it was an Aussie Rules team, could have that wrong, but I think it was Aussie Rules, and he was in charge of their supplementation. Whatever he gave them had a banned substance in it, and that team, like every player, tested positive for this banned substance, so the whole team had to miss the entire season. And so, you know, obviously that's when investors and that kind of stuff will get really pissed off and say, what the hell is going on here? How could this have happened? And they dug into it, and your man, I think, had no qualifications or almost no qualifications at all. And so they were like, you know, how is this possible at, like, you know, an elite level of sports that somebody was able to get this access to these players and give them the supplement or whatever. So he was saying, and like that was when everything changed. They changed like the legislation around it. So he was saying it probably takes something like that, like a major scandal, to happen before it's going to be something that governing bodies will really be arsed with handling.
Yeah, it's crazy. And like some of the if you go back through some of the like the supplement papers, like up to like 50% in some cases have been contaminated with like heavy metals. Or there's one paper where they saw they bought like 50 different supplements off the shelves, and like 30% of them had like pro hormones or steroid like compounds in them.
Yeah.
And it's because they're not regulated and screened like pharmaceuticals. So you don't know where they're actually being made, all this kind of stuff. So contamination and the risk of an adverse analytical finding or failing a doping test for an athlete, which means they could potentially be banned, which means they lose their income, their sponsorships. Like you said, if it's a team, investors start asking questions, the team loses out. And the other thing is their reputation.
That's what I was going to say as well.
You have something in your system that shouldn't be there, whether it was intentional or not, you're always going to be tired of that. That'll follow you for your career. So the lesser, I suppose, no, I suppose there still is important. Is like the quality of the supplement. There's no guarantee it does what it says. And the last one then would be like potential side effects of the supplement if they haven't actually been measured and tracked for a long period of time. So like in terms of where do you go to report a supplement side effect? It's not like you ring up the supplement company, because they'll probably be like, oh, thanks for that.
Yeah.
That can be potentially an issue. And then there are cases where, like, was it the pre-workout stuff from a few years ago contained basically MDMA, or a very MDMA-like compound in it. Jack 3D. Am I allowed to say that on your podcast?
If I get sued, I'll blame you.
It didn't have MDMA. It had like DNA, which was a very similar chemical structure related to the methamphetamine family.
I don't think they're even still in business anymore, are they? Do they not have a load of people have heart attacks or something?
That's why, because they had all these stimulants in that they hadn't listed on the label. So people were double scooping, or probably dry scooping, or whatever they do. Jesus. But I think there was a lady in the 2012 marathon in London had taken some of these stuff. I think she took Jack 3D and she had a heart attack in the middle of her 20-kilometer race or whatever. It was a combination of that and dehydration. And you just, like, if things aren't regulated and they have things in them that they shouldn't have that could have side effects, you need to tell people about them.
Yeah. And I think you were saying the last chat we had to make sure that you look for the batch tested.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If you're buying
so if you're looking for supplements in your athlete that's in a testing pool, or just in general population, just to save yourself any unwanted concerns, is Inform Sport is the kind of third-party independent lab, or the website anyway, that kind of controls, I think it's LGA Labs, where they'll test supplements, batches of supplements from different manufacturers, and they will say whether or not the supplement is clear from contamination and isn't safe to take. So they don't actually say whether the supplement does what it says on the tin. They just say it's safe to consume because it doesn't contain anything not listed on its ingredients label.
Right.
So that would be where I direct people. And when I was in Munster, we always had to make sure that if we were ordering supplements in, it always had to come through either our contracted supplier, and we always made sure that we worked with a supplier that had batch tested supplements. Because if we didn't, it means we wouldn't be able to order supplements in because they wouldn't have anything our athletes could take anyway. And then we had to be careful of, like, even little things like athletes would come in and be like, I take a Barocca, is that okay? And you're still a bit like, not really, because it may have something in it that's not on the label. So we'll get you multivitamins instead, type of thing. And you just have to make sure even those are batch tested. It's just minimize all the risk wherever possible.
Yeah.
So brings me back to, if you can get it from food, get it from food. And then if you really think you need a supplement, have some sort of assessment that tells you, okay, you probably should need a supplement. So some sort of biochemical or blood marker or something like that. And then supplement and see what's the minimum amount you need to give before, you don't need to, you're not given like 5,000 IUs of vitamin D because there's no sun. It's kind of like, can we measure it and see what you actually need 2,000, things like that.
Well, I think that's a good point to end on. It's been going for a while here. I wanted to cover BCAAs with you as well, but we can save that till next time.
No, go on, fire it in.
Well, okay, just quickly before we finish up then, BCAAs, is it something that is going to be given a performance enhancing effect if you are taking in enough protein already to begin with?
Nope. Waste
Okay.
of money.
Yeah.
If you're buying whey, you're already getting your BCAAs. If you're eating enough protein from animal sources, you're already getting enough BCAAs.
Yeah.
Save your money. Keep your urine less
Cool.
expensive.
All right. We'll keep that short and sweet. Because we're done loads of talking about protein today. If anybody wants to follow you, Instagram, is that the main social media you use?
Yeah. At Rich_Kelly 33.
And you throw up some recipes and stuff like that on there. I see.
Yeah, I started doing reels, which I think I get a lot more engagement with those than I did with the stories and stuff. So,
well, that's just because we've all got tiny attention spans now.
It's the algorithm, bro. Got to
Yeah.
feed the algorithm. So yeah, Rich Kelly is probably the main place. I'm on Twitter, but I just kind of use that to reshare or retweet papers. And usually I'll be scrolling Twitter and I'll see a paper that I want to read. So I'll retweet it. And then when I've got time on the weekend, I'll go back and be like, what was that? Read it, and then I'll go and read the paper.
And are you offering any kind of coaching services if people want to get in contact or anything like that? Or are you just working with teams at the moment?
No, I'm doing private clients at the moment. I'm kind of full, but I think there could be some availability coming up in the next couple of weeks. I might be finishing up with a client. But yeah, I do that if people slide in my DMs on Instagram. That's probably the best place to get me. I haven't gone down the route of setting up a website yet or anything like that. It might be something I'll look into in the future. But for the now, it hasn't been my priority, let's say.
Cool. Well, I can tell you from experience, Instagram does not like you trying to take people off their platform to a website. So it doesn't always work out. Cool. Well, listen, thanks a million for all of the information there. I'm sure we'll do it again if you're up for that. Sometime maybe a bit later on when we can accumulate some topics to talk through again.
If your generous listeners are so open to having me back on like they were this time, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So
as
thanks
I said,
to everyone that checked out the last one and found it beneficial. If I can help in any way, like Hill said, hit me up.
Brilliant. All right. Well, have a good Halloween. And I'm sure I'll talk to you on Instagram about a meme or something like that soon enough.
I hope so. Take it easy, bud.
Cheers, man. See you.